Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Nicole Belt to the show. Nicole is a building biologist, best-selling author, and founder of the Australian College of Environmental Studies. With a background in naturopathy and environmental health, Nicole is a leading voice on how our homes impact our well-being. She's here to share her experience on health hazards in our home and practical tips to create a healthier living space. Nicole, thank you so much for joining.
Very welcome, Kathy.
Look, for listeners who don't know about you, can you share about your background and what led you to be a building biologist?
Sure. Was working as a naturopath and acupuncturist for 15 years and noticed many of my patients with autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, asthma, allergies, they wouldn't respond to changes in diet or supplements. And at the same time, we bought our first home, moved in, and within a couple of weeks, my husband and I were developed insomnia, so didn't sleep very well, didn't think anything of it.
Oh,
Within 12 months, fell pregnant and miscarried at 11 weeks, and subsequently went on to have 10 miscarriages in this house. No one was able to identify why. So we went to the recurrent miscarriage clinic. Didn't qualify for IVF because I got pregnant easily. Went to many, many specialists, and essentially they excluded any pathology and said, "We don't know why you're miscarrying, just keep trying." About 7 years into the miscarriages, I was talking to my neighbour, and she said, "No one successfully had children in that house you're living in," which is nearly 70 years old. And I literally ran around the house and went, "What's going on with this home?" And noticed we were sleeping adjacent to the meter panel, and also that there was, traffic-related air pollution from the T intersection we were living on. So I started to measure the carbon monoxide levels, which would triple in our bedroom before they dissipate in the afternoon, before the peak hour traffic kicked in. It was all within exposure standards. Parks Victoria came regularly to spray pesticides on our boundary because we were on the Yarra River, and I got a dowsing to find out if there was geopathic stress on the site, which there was directly under our bed, and correlated with the European wasp nest in that alignment. I started to look at how the built environment could impact health, looked at the data from the US EPA at the time, and that would have been in the early 90s, and realised that there was a lot on indoor air quality, which I had not been trained to address in my naturopathic or my acupuncture degree. So I just literally spent years studying this. And I said to my husband, "We need to get out of this bedroom and get to the back bedroom," which we did. Subsequently fell pregnant again with twins naturally, and the rest is history. I had 3 kids who twins are now 18. So it completely changed the way I looked at how I practiced. I started to walk into my patient's home, and most of them were impacted by something in the house. I then did a lot of research, got a whole lot of people together, and then started the building biology industry in Australia, which is the only government accredited training in the world, undergraduate training that's government accredited, and started to train people how to assess hazards in the built environment. Most of the work we do is actually testing water damaged buildings and mould. Mould is bigger than Ben Hur, much bigger than we ever realise in terms of its impact on health. But we also look at electromagnetic fields, allergens, and chemicals.
You just touched on mold there. So different types of mold, aren't they? Do you want to maybe touch on the different types of mold that people experience?
Well, water damaged building mold is in every home. Normally, it's Asco and Basidiospores, which is naturally found in the outdoors as a result of the soil. You'll find that throughout the globe, Asco and Basidio account for more than 60% of the ambient spore levels. So when you open windows and doors, they naturally come in. That's really normal to have some form of fungal particulate in the built environment. The issue is in the presence of moisture, whether it's liquid water or water vapor that's at higher levels above 70%, that's when the spores will utilize the source of moisture and start to produce more fungal particulate, spores, hyphae, conidiophores, which when they become airborne can cause adverse health effects. So the type of molds we'd see in a water damage mold would be Aspergillus, Penicillium, Gutomium, cladosporium at high levels. Cladosporium also is quite high outdoors at certain times of the year. Stachybotrys or black mold, as some people refer to as. So they're the typical molds, with Aspergillus and penicillin being the most important indicator of water damage.
You just touch on building biology. So what is building biology?
So a building biologist is trained to identify and assess health hazards in the built environment, which I mentioned: mold, electromagnetic fields, lead, allergens, all of those sort of things, and provide recommendations in order to reduce exposure. The type of work we're doing is for a lot of people with asthma, allergies, chronic fatigue syndrome, people who have chronic adverse health effects, especially that is marked with long-term fatigue that's not alleviated by rest. Often have gone through many medical clinicians or naturopaths and not getting results with bioceuticals. So that's when they tend to find us last to identify if there's something going on. And the things we're looking for are what the history, when did the adverse health effects start, what month of what year, what was going on in your life at the time, did you move house, did you renovate a bathroom, did you have a water event, are you sleeping near a meter panel? All of these things. I think what people and clinicians don't realize is we spend 90% of our time in the built environment, for most of us, unless you're a tradie or a landscape gardener. And what happens is your risk is much greater if the built environment is not healthy. Then that can have substantial exposures to hazards that you often can't see or smell that are contributing to health problems.
So what are some of the problems that can be caused by some of these hazards in the home? Is fatigue a big one of them?
Yes. Fatigue
Okay.
is can be due to many different things, of course, stress, emotional stress, trauma, um, poor diet, lack of exercise, too much exercise, a lot of different things. But in terms of long-term fatigue that's not alleviated by rest, we're looking at electromagnetic field exposures. We're looking at, and mainly because EMFs can impact sleep. We're looking at mold can impact sleep because it affects melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is important for also for sleep as well as many other um, functions within the body. Uh, People have severe allergies. They're not going to sleep because they've got a lot of flu-like symptoms. There's a lot of inflammation in the body, and that in itself will affect fatigue. So there's definitely many things in the built environment that can cause that.
And what other chronic illnesses that can be impacted by some of these health hazards?
Absolutely. So you're looking at the main things I would say in the built environment that's related to the home. I mentioned chronic fatigue syndrome. Some will
Yeah.
refer to it as chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, or dampness hypersensitivity syndrome, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, multiple chemical sensitivity, some forms of atopic dermatitis like eczema as a result of chlorine in water or the bathing water. You're looking at, chemicals and products, cleaning products, personal care products that people bring in that they could be reacting to. A big one is washing powders. If they're using washing powders loaded with brightness or fragrances, they'll end up often with skin irritation. Or kids with flame resistant pajamas loaded with formaldehyde or flame retardants. I mean, the chemical load is just huge. Often
Okay.
people are bringing them in assuming it's being tested on human health, which often it isn't.
One of the things I heard is that 80% of our homes are considered unhealthy. What are the types of reasons that cause most of our homes to be unhealthy?
I mean, your allergen load. If you've got wall-to-wall carpets, you've got 20 kilos of dust accumulating in the 6 carpeted room house every year for the rest of its life. So, that will have your dust mites, your pet allergens, your dander skin cells. It's potentially your pests fast. It's going to have all your chemical load in the carpet dust. So that's where a lot of kids will be exposed because their breathing zone is close to the floor. But yeah, essentially so things that are not obvious, like fertility. So infertility, we notice that there's often an increased toxicity with each generation, especially with persistent organic pollutants, which are passed in utero, passed through breast milk, and retardants in all our electronics, in a lot of our building materials, our carpets, our olefin carpets. So the toxic load is increased all the time, and this in itself can cause increased infertility. Men with electromagnetic field exposures where they have their cell phones in terms of, causing damaging DNA. We know sperm count has dropped by at least 50% in the last 50 years. Pesticide exposures from the outside and use of pesticide sprays inside. So there's a lot going on inside that essentially can impact human health in almost every chronic disease.
How do these things get into our body and then cause these chronic illnesses?
Most of it will be through accelerating oxidative stress. So at a cellular level, what happens is, for example, with electromagnetic fields, it acts on voltage-gated calcium channels, especially in the central nervous system, the heart and the testes. It then allows calcium influx, which is really a stress response of the cell. If it's too high, not the oxidative stress is increased to the point where the antioxidant enzymes can't reduce those free radicals, that's when you get mitochondrial damage. That's when your energy levels drop. That's when you can increase DNA strand breaks and cancer risks. That's when the cell dies and then the organ starts to be impacted. So most of these, whether it's chemicals, electromagnetic fields, through oxidative stress, certainly with chemicals, if they're hormone disrupting chemicals, they can bind to estrogen receptor sites. So they compete for these receptor sites, so that especially during critical windows of development like puberty, childhood, um, you know, that can all have huge ramifications in terms of how that results in reproductive health, fertility, obesity. I mean, you've got chemicals now that are called obesogens. That infant obesity has increased before kids have even eaten because they've now got higher toxic load of chemicals that can increase fat cell size, fat cell number, all of these things. So, we're realizing that with each generation that they're more and more toxic based on the biomonitoring studies, and this can predispose them to many of the chronic illnesses later on in life.
Let's talk about EMFs for a second. What are the main these we've got Wi-Fi now, there's smart meters. What are the main contributors, do you think, to the two EMFs that are causing some of these health issues for us?
Well, it's all based on what's closest to your person. So your cell phone will be the greatest exposure. We're talking like hundreds of thousands of microwatts per square meter. Building biology standards ideally should be under 10 in a sleeping environment. So just using a cell phone near your person will dramatically escalate your exposure to radio frequencies. Hopefully, your antioxidant capacity will overwhelm that with episodic high levels. But the reality is your cell phone should never be on your person and it should never be used next to your head. Always text, use loudspeaker instead, but never next to your person. Then as you move away from the body, you're talking about iPads, Wi-Fi enabled devices, you're talking about potentially PCs, and then of course your Wi-Fi routers, extenders, boosters, and all your smart appliances, then your smart meter, and then of course all the exterior sources such as your mobile phone base stations.
We all live with Wi-Fi and we all live with phones, so we can move our mobile phones sort of away from us. What can we do in a household that has, or even an office building where we are surrounded by Wi-Fi and all these electronic devices? Is there something we can do to is there something we can do to reduce the impact?
The best way to go about that is to change the way you use your cell phone, which I just mentioned, or if you're electrically sensitive, using VoIP or Skype on a hardwired PC, hardwiring all your electronic devices using the wiring in your home or Cat6 cables, Ethernet cables, so that you don't have routers, extenders, boosters, because they're going to be really high in terms of the level of exposure. And it's like asbestos. Asbestos was such a brilliant material used in 3,000 building materials is incredible, and everyone used it, so everyone was complacent. The reality is radio frequencies from all your Wi-Fi enabled devices accelerates oxidative stress, increases risk for brain tumors, especially if your cell phone's next to your head for 30 minutes or more per day for 10 years. I mean, that's what the data is saying. So this understanding that we use it so, how we can reduce our exposure, but the most important way is to hardwire the house. If you're renting, get cabling if you can, just to reduce that exposure, or at least turn off your Wi-Fi routers, get rid of your extenders and boosters, contain where you're using your Wi-Fi in the house so it's not impacting you while you sleep, which is the critical time that can have the worst adverse outcomes. And The other alternative course is to look at shielding. So shielding is a last resort because it can often reduce one field but exacerbate another. Things like crim-safe metal fly screens can help reflect radio frequencies from a nearby phone tower. Having a colour bond roof, if the radiation from the mobile phone base station comes towards your house through the roof, then if it's a metal roof, it'll bounce off. The problem is that if you have a lot of metal in your home, especially in the walls, then you can't use Wi-Fi enabled devices because it bounces back in like a microwave oven effect. So it will increase your exposures to these radio frequencies.
And what about you mentioned shields. I just pulled one off my phone, so this is Orgon Effects, I think this one is. What's your sort of thoughts around these ones? Do you think these actually help?
They make no difference to our readings. And when you
Bugger.
ask the manufacturer to provide research on what it does, the answer often comes back as, well, it helps your immune system deal with it. And I said, well, which immune markers are you referring to? And then they don't respond to any of my calls. So unfortunately, a lot of people spend hundreds or thousands of dollars in technology or good marketing that has no verified or quantified data to show that it does anything. So as a expert in this field, I cannot possibly recommend devices that make no difference to my readings. In fact, and the question I would ask with on your phone, so on your phone, I'd say, can you still make or receive calls with that device
Mm.
on your phone?
Yes, of course,
That's
yeah.
right. So the radiation's still
Yeah, okay.
mm,
Okay, and the same goes for some of these things that you plug into your house, GeoCleanse or whatever they are, same thing? Yeah.
exactly. They make no difference to our lives. So unless they can provide verified data that shows exactly the mechanism of action,
Yep.
then
Uh,
how can I possibly recommend that? Especially because they make no difference to our meters. Yeah.
so how do you measure it?
So you've got different meters are used for different fields. You're using high frequency meters to measure radio frequencies and depends on the frequency range. So we've got 2 meters, they're about $6,000 for the two, and they basically contain omnidirectional antennas and directional antennas. And the reason why that's important is because you want to know what's the readings in areas where people spend time during their
Yes.
maximum exposure, and more importantly, what direction is it coming from in order to isolate the source. So just having an omnidirectional meter, it tells us this is what the reading is here at the desk, but it doesn't tell us what the source is. So if you turn everything off in the house, if it's still high, you know it's the area, then with our meters, which are gold plated, we are able to establish what direction and then look at the um, RFNSA or MapPrab websites to establish where the cell phone towers are in relation to the home. You'll have different meters for magnetic fields, which you're measuring from the current or movement of electrons in the building wiring. So you use a Gauss meter for that, as opposed to a high frequency meter for radio frequencies. And then, multimeters you can use for electric meters. Then you've got, and the fourth field is dirty power or dirty electricity, which you use a Stetzer device for that or some form of other meter that enables you to quantify that.
And you mentioned cell towers before. I'm quite conscious here. I know where our towers are. They're pretty prominent. What's your thoughts around living close to those cell towers?
Generally, the rule of thumb is within 400 metres line of sight. So if you can see, especially if you're on a second or third story and you can see cell phone towers within 400 metres of that area, that the level will be elevated. It will all fall within the Australian standard because the Australian exposure standard is not a health-based standard. In fact, there's no standard beyond 30-minute exposures. So there is actually no exposure standard for the public based on low-level exposures that are typically found in real-world scenarios. So from a building biology perspective, all the international guidelines for non-ionising radiation, IGNIR guidelines, you'll find that within 400 metres, that'll definitely be very high. It's really important, therefore, to think about, at the time you're doing the measurement, because the more people are using the cell phone tower during peak hour, the higher the radiation. So timing of exposure becomes really important. In terms of reducing exposure, again, metal is important, metal fly screens. Shielding paint can be used, but I do find it's our last resort because it can cause other problems. The other options is to get metal fly screen and create a screen. So if you know you're getting cell phone radiation through a window, for example, you could actually put that mesh behind or put it into the curtain, for example, or you could use shielding materials as curtains. You may or may not need to earth that. That can be a way. But the other thing is, if your house is old and you have no vapor membranes, that aluminium foil in the wall, then it will be coming through the walls and the windows. If you've got a new build where you have vapor membranes, it will reflect it from the walls. So this is why bland generalized statements are not helpful, because until you measure, you don't know.
Let's touch on some of the other things in the home. So some of the other chemicals in the home that could be um, causing fatigue or chronic illness or just having an overall impact on our health. So can we touch on some of these sort of everyday things in the home that people might be purchasing?
Sure. Well, the big one will be fragrances, air fresheners and perfumes will be my first. In fact, my first one will be pesticides. Pesticides are extremely toxic, whether they're the organophosphate um, type of pesticides. Big no, big no. So, thinking about pest management, what do they do for that? Their garden chemicals will be, an issue. So looking at what that is. Secondly, fragrances, air fresheners, perfumes, they can often contain phthalates, which are hormone disrupting chemicals. That's an issue. Phthalates are also in plasticizers in vinyl. So vinyl flooring is really a very big red flag because, those phthalate plasticizers are not bonded to the vinyl, and that can get into the household dust where the kids could be exposed to elevated levels of hormone disrupting chemicals. So you really want to, there's no place for vinyl in a home as far as I'm concerned, not vinyl curtains, not vinyl shower curtains, not vinyl flooring. It's a very big red flag. The other ones will be things like surfactants and detergents. If they're too strong, especially in body products, they can be drying to the skin. But the big ones for me are definitely the pesticides and the fragrances of all the ones. And of course, the non-stick chemicals, your PFAS and your waterproofing related chemicals in your clothing or your cookware.
Listeners, if there were the top 3 things that they could do in their home to just reduce the impact or make their homes healthier, what are some of the top things you would say to focus on?
Really, the allergen reservoir is important, because the way you deal with dust is the way you deal with mould, or your allergens and chemicals. So, if you've got wall-to-wall carpet, you've got anyone with asthma or allergies, I'd say get rid of the carpet, at least get a good vacuum cleaner to deal with that. That would be my biggest one. How you deal with, making sure that you reduce the dust with good microfiber cloths, slightly damp, followed by with a clean tea towel. Dusting is important. If you see dust, it's time to clean, because that's where a lot of those allergens and spores, et cetera, will be. So dust is really important. Vacuum cleaner, the type of vacuum cleaner, like people buy these stick vacuum cleaners that really are not for $1,000, ridiculous. A barrel vacuum cleaner that has a good HEPA filter, H13 class, as a minimum, is important, and some of the best are under $500. So, they don't need to spend this amount of money for something that actually doesn't perform very well and it's not considered to be healthy.
You mentioned obesity before, and this seems, I don't know if it's a new term, but it seems to be sort of a new term that's floating around. So can you explain obesogens and how some of these health hazards can cause known to be obesogens, and how they can actually cause us or cause our society to have an increase in obesity?
Yeah, so I said in terms of obesogens, they act, especially during critical windows of development, by increasing fat number and fat size in utero, which is an issue, because if you think about in a fetus, where is the fat in a growing child in utero? And there isn't any fat until the last 5 or 6 weeks. So most of the fat will be in the central nervous system. So it's getting dumped straight into the brain and the central nervous system. And that's the problem with a lot of these chemicals is they're lipophilic, they're fat-loving. They're not gonna come out through the sweat. They're not gonna come out with sauntering. They're not gonna come out in the urine. They tend to stay where the fat tissues are, unfortunately. Obesogens are things I've mentioned before, all your fragrances, your phthalates, your BPA, your bisphenols, your plastics with bisphenols, tins lined with BPA. So many of your food tins, if you're eating food that's tinned and it doesn't say BPA free, it's probably lined with hormone disrupting chemicals that are imparting into the tomato puree because tomatoes. So these things are important to reduce when it comes to cooking. Cook from scratch as much as you can. Know where your fruit and veggies are coming from. Know your butcher is really important. Go organic as a minimum, going organic, especially for the Dirty Dozen, which the Environmental Working Group has published in terms of the highest load of pesticides will tend to be your berries, for example. Your lowest level of pesticides will be those with the thicker skin, your avocados, your mangoes, and your root vegetables like your potatoes and your onions, for example. You can get away with not going organic there. So really reducing the pesticide load, which are often obesogens, your phthalates, your bisphenols, and your plastics, not cooking with plastics as in, heating them up in microwaves or ovens, for example, and going back to basics, glass, ceramic, stainless steel, all of those things are very important.
There has been some correlation or some suggest that mold and possibly other toxins in the home environment can have an impact on or further impact on kids on the spectrum. Do you work with kids on the spectrum? And are there any other causes that you see between some of these home toxins and kids either on the spectrum or with ADHD or general behavioral issues?
Well, look, we've definitely seen an explosion, I'd say a pandemic of neurodevelopmental disorders, autism, ADHD. ADHD is about 10% of children now. Autism is about 3% of the Australian population, children, which is the highest in the world, for the record. And that's increased 3,000% since the 1950s. Now, a lot of people would argue better diagnosis is accounted for that. That's true, but it only accounts for 20% increase in diagnosis, according to the US Department of Education. So we've seen a natural explosion of neurodevelopmental disorders, which coincides with changes in farming practices and introduction to pesticides. But in terms of the house mould, yes, I've seen a small cohort of kids with exposures to high levels of mould and mycotoxins who've completely reversed their autism by actually addressing that, which made me think it's not autism, it was actually a mould illness in that case.
We had a similar experience. I think he tested positive to mold, and we did a lot of work to reduce his overall toxins. There was a number of things, heavy metals, as you mentioned, he tested positive to. So yeah, even though I don't think the studies are, from what I've read, not conclusive. I think there's definitely seems to be a correlation. Maybe can we talk about people's toxic load? Because what I find is that some people can handle a lot and then other people can't handle a lot. So some of these toxins that may impact some people are not going to impact others. So I think this is really important to cover because particularly with children and particularly with sensitive children, a lot of these children they're testing positive to heavy metals and mold and all these toxins in their body, whereas their brothers and sisters living in the same household are fine, not testing positive to any. So is this something you can cover? Just talk about how different people detoxify some of these toxins differently.
Sure, that's a good question. First, start with the genes. The genetics is really important to look at what's going on in their phase two pathways, because these pathways, glucuronidation, sulfation, glutathione conjugation, are critical for neurotransmitters, catecholamines, dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, but also the same pathways that a lot of the environmental chemicals use to get out of the body. So with these kids, what's really important is first to identify, is there a toxic metal that's impacting their capacity to deal with detoxification, or is it their mold, like a virus or a bacteria or fungi? And mold is a big one for affecting detoxification pathways. It causes traffic jams. once you have traffic jams in these pathways, the neurotransmitters can't get out. So their service life is their half life is much higher, and that can cause lots of different issues in terms of mental health, etc. So detoxification is one of the most important areas to start. And like you mentioned, the gut microbiome is critical. We know the gut microbiome is probably more effective at detoxing chemicals than the liver. There's over 1,000 bacteria that they know can be involved in detoxification of chemicals. And of course, these kids, especially with autism, have high levels of Clostridia bacteria difficile, which is causing a lot of byproducts, which is also clogging up the detoxification pathways. So it's like you've got to find the linchpin, and the linchpin is a microbe such as a pathogenic bacteria or mold. Toxic metal is the other one. They're the two big ones you want to identify before a child's diagnosed with autism, to see if there's something like that that's affecting their detoxification pathway that leads to autism-like symptoms. And if that can be addressed and reduced, then maybe they don't have those symptoms. So that's the first thing I think all kids should be screened for before they're even diagnosed, as you mentioned. In terms of detoxification capacity, genetics is huge. So my son, for example, cannot detox most chemicals, looking at his genetics, and he has ADHD severely and OCD. His serotonin levels are obliterated because the amount of enzyme involved in breaking it down is so fast that whatever serotonin he produces is low. And that's a genetic inheritance. So what you can do is use specific bioceuticals in order to target those pathways. And ironically, what he did throughout his childhood was to actually, I call him Forrest Gump. He just starts walking. He just
Yeah.
goes out of the house and he walks for up to 10 kilometres, comes back and he's in suburbs away and I have to pick him up. It helps him produce serotonin, gets his vitamin D, which is incredibly low. All of these things he's doing, it's almost like a stimulating reaction to boost up his serotonin levels without thinking about it. So genetics and metabolomics will be really important moving forward with these kids, understanding, as you said, toxic metal, any viruses or microbes like mold, and their genetic pathways, in order to target bioceuticals to really help these kids and hopefully get them functioning relatively normal and getting the best version of them in their life.
Is there a story that you can tell us, someone you've worked with that you've seen a big change with through doing what you do?
I think the biggest change is, watching my building biologists working with patients and families whose lives are obliterated by mould, have been medical gaslit by multiple the medical industry, who are often not trained to identify these environmental sensitivities, and able to, identify what the problem is, remediate the house, or worst case scenario, move, which fortunately doesn't happen too often, and get their life back, get their brain back. I mean, the first symptoms of this is often brain fog, poor
Yes.
concentration and memory, missing words mid-sentence, unable to, you just feel like you're not yourself. Short-term memories obliterated, the relationship suffers, the relationship with their partner, their family, and it often is because they've got a genetic predisposition that makes them more sensitive, and their detoxification pathways are compromised. So in that case, you're looking at reducing their chemical load, really getting rid of their personal care products and all the perfumes, reducing what cleaning products they're using, getting good vacuum cleaners, reducing exposures to the chemicals, to EMFs, so that they can sleep in a clean environment, and then a good naturopath or integrative doctor to target binders and nutrition to be able to start removing this out of the body so that they can live a relatively normal life. I mean, I see that all the time.
Can we talk about schools for a minute? One of the things just about I can look after my home, so my boy is quite sensitive to a lot of different things. And I can sort of look after my home, but then I also worry about what he's exposed to in the school environment. And even so, when we talk about schools and even offices, do you ever talk to schools, or what do you think a role there? Do you think there is a role that schools can play in this?
Well, firstly, I think a lot of schools are water damage and they're underfunded and under-resourced to fix it. So that's, if it's not asbestos is the problem, it's often mold. And it's a dramatic escalation of asthma and allergies and other symptoms, unfortunately. So I think there's a lot that can be done to to fix this, but unfortunately they're under-resourced. Is there a lot they can do about it? Yes, they can do that. Secondly, which most won't do because they don't have the funding. So it's really important to get your house as healthy as possible to give the kids the resilience to deal with the environments, which unfortunately most of the time you can't change. The option, I've had a couple of wins where a mother's gone in and said, "Look, this portable is making my kid sick. I need to put my child in another class." They have, and they've completely got better. So that is a
Wow.
possibility because I understand school is hamstrung by what resources they have to fix the
Mm.
building structure. But
Yeah.
certainly education would be great. I think, you know, if the government acknowledged how bad the housing stock was, the schools, the Department of Housing, it'd send this country broke. So I think there's a concerted effort not to address this because the cost to fix it would be so enormous. But the good news is, I think for householders, what's really important in the training programs I give, and I'm about to launch Mould, Mastering Mould for consumers, is maintenance is very important. Your house, like your body, needs to be serviced and maintained. You can't just live in it and do nothing because over time it will deteriorate and things need to be replaced. Whether it's resealing the roof, whether it's improving the drainage and the stormwater system, whether it's replacing the carpets, all of these things are very important. So in the course, I really focus on what are the biggest elephants that you need to address that can divert from the worst case scenario for mold exposures.
Okay. So as a building biologist, when you walk into a home, what a typical scenario or a typical session look like for you?
So I normally take a history, which takes about 45 minutes online, and I normally do that with the client on their phone. So they take me around the house through their phone to get an idea of what the issues are. I can see the rooms, they can show me the visible mold, condensation, or whatever issues they've got. And that tells me a lot in that already. So I'm checking occupant history, building history, I'm looking for hazards. Um, I'm looking at proximity and sources of electromagnetic fields and allergens and moisture. So I do that first and then would go in and look, most people call us to check for mold, but occasionally what we find is as a building biologist, you have to be prepared for all of that. So you're looking where the smart meter is, you're looking where the router is, because they've called you in for mold, but in fact, they're actually likely to be electrically sensitive, or they're coming in for mold and it's actually the dog and the cat. Now, I'm finding 10% of my clients are reacting to their very pets and don't know it.
Okay. Oh, that's a bit sad, isn't it? Is there something we can do without removing our friendly pets?
Yeah, looks desensitization can be quite effective. So that is something you consider in terms of reducing your reaction to the pet because pets are really important for mental health. I can't even imagine my house without my boxer dog.
Yeah.
He's often the nicest person, the most excited to see me when I walk in. But desensitization is something to do. And reducing all the allergen load, your carpets, your curtains, really thinking about what allergen reservoirs you have to reduce that exposure.
And I wanted to ask you if you had a billboard for a would it say?
That's a probably wouldn't be related to my work, I think. I'm not sure. I have to think about that. What would it say? You know, be selfish, as in, if you don't look after yourself, you can't look after anybody else. So I think as a postmenopausal woman, you realize when your resilience is depleting rapidly with teenagers and hormones, that it's
Yeah.
important to self-reflect and to go inwards, to really look at your values, who you are and where you are in the world. But, it's
Yeah.
important to focus on oneself because you can't give to others unless you do that.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. So can you if people want to follow you work, maybe tell us a little bit about your course coming up and about where we can find you and follow you. You've got so much information in your brain, and this is just a quick snapshot. So how can people learn more and deep dive into all the different things that you've touched on?
Sure. I wrote a book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family. So that's an ebook that's available on my website. My website is buildingbiology.com.au. Lots of resources there. You'll also see the Master Mold course, everything you never wanted to know about mold. I also have a course on allergens, if people have asthma and allergies, how to deal with that in the home. Um, the main thing I do is actually run the college, the Australian College of Environmental Studies, which provides nationally accredited training in becoming a building biologist, mold testing technician, professional organizer, feng shui. There's a lot of great courses there that, if you're thinking about pivoting in this industry, a 3-month part-time course could change your life in terms of making a difference to other people's homes. So have a look at the college website. It's aces.edu.au.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. You've just got a wealth of information. I'm going to go back and rewatch this and just write down a whole bunch of things so that I can address all of them. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And look, I think your work in this industry is really important. I think there's a lot of um, things that we don't necessarily see, we don't think about as harming us. And I like that there's more and more visibility and more information coming out about this sort of stuff. And I think what you're doing is really, really important. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy.